Now in studio, Delaware Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who sits on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. Senator, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Bret. Great to be on with you.
No less. Hearing a lot of stuff on Capitol Hill. You guys are getting briefings. Had this impassioned plea from the Ukrainian president today. Is there something that's changing up there as far as the bipartisan push to meet those demands or needs?
Bret, this was a remarkable, powerful speech by President Zelensky this morning. I don't think I've seen this much unity in Congress in a long time. He gave a forceful, moving, engaging advocacy for the people of Ukraine and a plea to us to help close his skies. And the Biden administration, President Biden, announced today an additional package of another $800 million that includes Stinger anti-air missiles, Javelin anti-tank missiles, a whole lot of other smaller material, drones, and an announcement they're going to provide higher capability air defense systems to Ukraine.
Which leaves a little vagueness there of what that is, but MiG-29s it is not.
It is not authorization to transfer planes from Poland through NATO into Ukraine. And I think publicly, what many of us have heard is there is some concerns about the balance between how effective they would be militarily versus how escalatory. To what extent would that bring Putin to a level of escalation in terms of using a cyber weapon against the United States or a tactical nuclear weapon? Is it worth the risk? I do believe the Biden administration, based on a classified briefing many of us got about an hour ago, is providing the air defense systems that Ukraine needs to close their skies.
You know, the administration, I don't want to dwell on this, but they keep on saying that the MiG is an offensive weapon and the Javelin is somehow defensive. I mean, there are a lot of people in the Pentagon who would say the Javelin anti-tank weapon is an offensive system. But is that splitting hairs or?
Maybe. Look, here's what matters. We need to do everything we can to give the Ukrainian people, their military, their government, the best chance to stop Putin, to defeat Putin's army, and to push back against this brutal invasion of Ukraine. Many of the most effective recent strikes into Ukraine were done by air-launched cruise missiles from Russian territory. There's nothing that we couldn't through a no-fly zone or through more MiGs or through anti-air systems prevent that without directly confronting Russian fighters, Russian pilots, Russian systems in Russian airspace.
Isn't the delineation really U.S. personnel crossing the line into Ukraine? If you're flying a no-fly zone, Americans could be hit and Americans could be in Ukraine.
That's right. If we tried to enforce a no-fly zone, not only would we have American pilots confronting Russian pilots and shooting at each other, but we would have to take out Russian air defense systems that are in Russia and in Belarus. That's how we effectively gain control of the airspace over Ukraine. That's a step I'm not willing to support, but I do think we should give Ukraine every possible tool that will allow them to prevent Russia from succeeding by using air against them.
I've heard the Secretary of State numerous times in recent days, even the President, reference World War III and trying to avoid World War III. There's this pushback on Capitol Hill from some saying we're sick of having Putin control the narrative here. He should be afraid of us, not us afraid of him. Where do you come down on that, and do you appreciate the World War III aspect of this?
Yes, so two things. I think the only positive of this horrific war, in which I was sad to hear that Fox has just lost 2 of your team on the ground, in this war that has cost American lives and Ukrainian lives, and now many volunteers from around the world are flooding in to help fight for Ukraine's freedom, the Russian military is genuinely struggling. They are not succeeding as they had thought they would. If this ends up being the quagmire that proves that Putin and Putin's approach to the world and an autocrat invading invading a country, a neighbor in an unjustified, uncalled for way, that gets stopped, that would be a great step forward for freedom. But frankly, we also have to be conscious that Putin controls one of the world's most sophisticated nuclear arsenals and has recently threatened to use nuclear weapons if necessary to prevent his defeat. So I don't think this is just a matter of who's tougher. I think we need to be clear-eyed about the risk.
Are you clear-eyed about where China is in this?
I'm clear that Xi Jinping and the PRC military leadership is watching every single move. And so President Biden's leadership in pulling together NATO, the West coming together quickly and forcefully to impose crippling sanctions on Russia, on Russian oligarchs, and to deliver military aid to Ukraine is the most powerful message we could send, that we do not support redrawing the map of the world through force anywhere in the world.
I want to ask you quickly, we just did this story out of the State Department. Axios broke the story that the Biden administration is considering removing Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from the terror blacklist in return for a public commitment from Iran to de-escalation in the region. This is the same group, Senator, that fired missiles, if not near our consulate in Iraq. It seems counterintuitive to take them off a blacklist.
It does, Bret. That's not something that I've heard. What I have heard is they are negotiating, and that removing the IRGC from the FTO list, the Foreign Terrorist Organization, is one of the demands Iran is making. I have not heard that is a demand that is being accepted. So I would be careful about accepting that as an outcome.
Is the administration bending over backwards to get this nuclear deal, kind of turning a blind eye to some of the other negative stuff that Iran is currently doing?
I hope not, because Iran is one of the most dangerous regimes in the region, if not the world. I understand that as they are coming closer and closer to having the fissile material for a nuclear weapon, we have to be mindful of that. And if we can restore a situation where we have transparency into their nuclear weapons ambition, their enrichment, that is a positive. But frankly, Iran, in recent years, has supported proxies in the region, has spread their missile technology, has directly attacked through their Houthi proxies some of our partners in the region. So Iran is not a country that I have any positive views of, and I think is genuinely destabilizing for the region.
Senator Coons, we always appreciate your time.
Thank you, Bret.
Thank you.